ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul O'Reilly. Some of you would remember my father, John O'Reilly, running these Anzac Day services here in Liberty Park for many years, together with the past RSL sub-branch presidents such as Edgar Townsend, Alan Elwyn, Arthur Aubrey, Bill Gleeson, and the current president, Frank. Others might remember him fondly or not as the old bloke riding his bicycle all over town in the last few years before his passing in 2014. This morning I'm going to share with you a little bit about my father's experiences throughout World War II, some of which are only his own words taken from his own diary. Dad began what he called his rookie training on his 19th birthday, initially in Sydney, then Melbourne, and finally a little closer to home in Cootamundra. He trained as an instrument fitter with the RAAF. Because of the severe lack of actual tools and instruments to practice on, he described his training as very theory-based. Before Dad was posted overseas, he was given 2 weeks final leave. During this 2-week period, he was given an official farewell organised by the local send-off committee here at Lake Cargelligo. I remember Dad telling me he got to enjoy a few beers during this 2-week period, but did not have to buy any of them. He was even loaned a car for the weekend by a commercial traveller who was in town. Lucky for him, there was no random breath testing in those days. On the 3rd of April 1942, Dad boarded the troop ship which would take him away from home to a war on the other side of the world. A day or so before departing, he ran into the late Edgar Townsend in Adelaide. I'm sure a few of you know the family who were still in the district. Edgar had just returned from the Middle East and Dad was just about to go there. I can only imagine how nice it must have been for them both to see a familiar face in such times of uncertainty. The ship was crewed mainly by Indians and Sikhs, some of whom were Muslims. For most of the soldiers, including Dad, it was their first contact with Islam. Being totally ignorant of the Islamic religion, the troops were inclined to make fun of the Indian Muslim crew whenever they were seen praying to Mecca at sunset. The soldiers were soon told to behave themselves. This would have been a small sample of the many different cultures that the soldiers would have been exposed to during their time in the war. It would have been the first time away from home, let alone being overseas for most of them. As the ship sailed into the tropics, the troops were allowed to sleep on the deck to escape the heat in the hold of the ship. Remember, these old ships had no air conditioning. Early in the morning, the Indian crew would wake them up yelling, "Wakey, wakey, washy decky," as they sprayed the decks with big hoses. The troops had to quickly roll up their bedding before it got too wet. I guess this was the chance for the crew to get back at them for the way they were teased when praying to Mecca. From India, they sailed to Egypt. Here they were loaded onto a train. This train trip must have been rather a messy one, though. The train was very old and had no toilets on it. Most of the troops got what they called jippo guts, which is a severe case of diarrhoea. As they were not allowed off the train under any circumstances because of the risk of landmines, the only option was to do what needed to be done out the window. To quote Dad, "We were especially careful not to look out the window as men were held out through the windows to relieve themselves." I hate to imagine the state of the outside of the train when they reached the destination, and can't imagine the inside being much better, actually. The final 150 kilometres was overland in a convoy of trucks belonging to the Royal Australian Air Force 3rd Squadron, the squadron which my father proudly served with for the duration of World War II. He was now a mere 30 kilometres from the front. I'd like to take this opportunity to share an excerpt from Dad's diary where he wrote a typical day in the life of an instrument fitter with the 3rd Squadron. While I was very much dependent on our location and the pressure of operations at the time, ground crews would be picked up from their tents before sunrise. We would be transported to our own aircraft, which was stabled in a large dispersal area. We would remove the cockpit cover, uncover the exhaust and air intakes, clean the windscreens, and generally check for sabotage or damage. We would help the pilot with his heavy parachute, go up his belts. We would then have to sit on the left wing of the plane to guide the pilot along the dusty tracks to the takeoff point. We would then be collected and taken for breakfast at the mess tent. Breakfast was usually a dried egg on hard biscuit and more biscuits with candle grease margarine. And I have no idea what candle grease margarine is. And some jam. One mug of tea was allowed from the copper, which had a suspended tea bag stewing in it. If urgent repairs were required to a damaged plane, you ate when relief arrived. The same tucker, but only cold. Our cooks did their best considering the poor materials at their disposal. As an example, one of their favourites was a slice of bully beef rolled in flour and fried in well-used fat. Initially, some of our mates refused to eat what was offered. However, hunger eventually changed their minds. Therefore, we were very grateful whenever comfort parcels arrived from Australia. We had to wash our clothes in petrol. No underwear was issued. A bath was a swim in the ocean if we were close enough to the ocean to do so. Any free time from operations was spent overhauling or rebuilding damaged aircraft. If the conditions got extremely dusty, this would mean a welcome day off. However, we were always on call. I remember when Dad was once asked, what is the first thought which comes to mind when someone mentions the war years? His response was water. There was never enough of it. I was always thirsty. Maybe this is why he'd always ensure we had a good supply of water whenever working on the farm or when travelling anywhere. Going back to Dad's diary, conditions were a lot better in Sicily and India, which is where we were in the second half of the war. We were given periodical leave. There was plenty of water. With the advent of aerographs, incoming mail was a lot faster. Instead of taking 3 months to get from home, it was now taking 7 days. And I think now we have the internet where they would get emails straight away. Christmas 1942 was my first Christmas away from Australia. At the time, the 3rd Squadron was camped near Bangladesh in Libya. Someone had managed to shoot a deer. This provided us the luxury of a little fresh meat along with a small supply of beer and other goodies which had been flown from HQ in Cairo. Unofficially, there was no fighting that day. This enabled us to relax a bit and enjoy Christmas. Finally, in May 1945, the Germans surrendered, bringing an end to the war in Europe. Shortly after, the Japanese were also forced to surrender. This brought an end to World War II. Although the war was over, it was a while before the troops could actually return to Australia. During this time, Dad did manage to have a few adventures, both sanctioned and unsanctioned. To quote him, I was talked into taking about 4 days absent without leave with 2 of our armourers who had a reputation as such adventurers. Had I known what they were really up to, I may have exercised more discretion. We started off at 5:30 a.m. hitchhiking. As we were wearing our slouch hats, we immediately attracted a New Zealand leave truck. They were able to give us a lift about halfway to our planned destination. We then managed to hitch the rest of the way in a radio van to our destination of Klagenfurt. It was then that my fellow travellers revealed the real reason for the trip. They wanted to acquire souvenirs from a German prisoner of war camp, especially German revolvers which were readily saleable to the Yanks. By this stage, it was too late for me to come around. The next move from my mates was to produce insignia stripes for the rank of pilot officers. By fitting these to the shoulder lapels of our shirts and discarding our hats for the night, we managed to enter a British officers' bar, and after some PR by one of my friends, he was an excellent actor, we were eventually invited to dinner in the unit's officers' mess. I suspect the British colonel was aware of what we were doing, but as he knew we were Australians and he was enjoying the tales told by my entertaining mate, plus the good liquor, the colonel may have decided to turn a blind eye. The alcohol had finally suppressed my feelings of almost overpowering apprehension as to what would have happened if they had asked for our identification. We would have faced the dire penalties of impersonating a superior officer. It was not till mid-August 1945 that the long journey home began for the 3rd Squadron. With so much damage to the infrastructure in Italy, it was no easy task getting the servicemen to a suitable shipping port in Italy, let alone finding ships to take them back to Australia. At one stage, they had to wait several days at the port of Taranto in Italy before a ship could take them further. During this time, Dad was booked by the British Royal Air Force Police for not having a tie on and for having his sleeves rolled up. The charge went back to his CO, who promptly tore it up. To quote Dad, the English police did find us colonials rather frustrating. They were never seen near the front line, however one had to keep an eye out for them when on leave. The rest of the journey back involved a couple of different stages with lots of waiting in between each stage. Finally they arrived back home late in 1945. This is what Dad wrote about his homecoming experience. After an absence of 3 years and 7 months, the ship's sound system announced the sighting of Rottnest Island, just outside of Perth. I can still remember the cheering bringing a lump to my throat, remembering that in the worst days of 1942, I sometimes wondered if I would ever see Australia again. Then not long after, the ABC News came over the ship's radio, making us feel really at home. The whole journey from Cairo to Fremantle took about 16 days. So much easier than the zigzagging battle on the way to the war. On berthing at Fremantle, all the Western Australian men were unloaded. We were to witness a lot of passionate family reunions. Of course, ours was to come. We arrived in Sydney on the 19th of May. I had just turned 24 and had been in the RAAF for 5 years. The next morning there was an unbelievable surprise. Bacon and eggs for breakfast. I hadn't seen such a menu for years. Finally we disembarked in the early afternoon. There were enormous welcoming crowds for those who had family or friends in Sydney. I had a short stay in Sydney before taking a train back to Cargelligo. My father was at the station to meet me. I was shocked to see how much he had aged since I had last seen him. He would have been 57 years old, and battling on the farm alone had left its mark on him. Mum was not well. The stress of having both her children away at war had taken its toll on her health. Unfortunately, she only lived 15 months and passed away at the age of 47 years. Like a lot of those who returned from World War II, it took Dad a while to find his place back in Australian society. He talked about this in his life story, which he wrote about 20 years ago. He wrote his life story and he talked about it. And he wrote, "It must be very difficult to understand the reactions of servicemen who have been involved in hazardous service for many years and then suddenly released to a normal life. Many have been subjected to long periods of trauma. This was especially the case for prisoners of war, frontline military, the crews of bomber command, submarine crews, and SAS men, to name a few. These men would have suffered a degree of what is now known as post-traumatic stress. There wasn't any counselling those days, except for a daily visit to the pub for temporary relief, which would eventually add to their problems. Unfortunately, as a result, a lot of returned men fell by the wayside." After doing various jobs, including working as a steam train driver for 11 years, Dad finally returned to Cargelligo and the family farm in 1960. He spent the remainder of his life here and was very happy to call Cargelligo home until his death in 2014. Dad never wanted to glorify war or wish the experience on anyone, but he did enjoy talking about his wartime memories, both good and bad, particularly in the later years of his life. It would amaze me how he would describe his war years like they were only yesterday, but he could not remember what had happened the day before. I believe it is the mateship and kindness of the many people he came into contact with that sustained him throughout the extremely difficult and challenging war years, which inspired and encouraged his commitment to and involvement with the RSL for most of his post-war life. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for letting me share a little bit of Dad's story and his history.